Hi, Aqua Roomers. It's time for chapter reading. Pa finally came back from town. That was a long journey, and the wind was horrible, and the mud was caked in the wheels of his wagon, and he had to stop, and it took him a long time to get home. The wind had begun when he was in town. People there told him he'd better wait until it blew itself out, but he wanted to get home. It beats me, he said, why they call a south wind a norther, and how a wind from the south can be so tarnation cold. I never saw anything like it. Down here in this country, the north end of a south wind is the coldest wind I ever heard of. Well, here in New England, we have a nor'easter, kind of the same thing. So the wind for a nor'easter is coming from the south, not the north. So I think Pa was in the middle of a nor'easter. He drank his coffee, wiped his mustache with his handkerchief, and said, "Ah, that hits the spot, Caroline. Now I'm beginning to thaw out." Then his eyes twinkled at Ma, and he told her to open the square package at the table. "Be careful," he said. "Don't drop it." Ma stopped unwrapping it and said, "Oh, Charles, you didn't." "Open it," Pa said. In that square package, there were 8 small squares of window glass. They would have glass windows in their house. Not one of the squares was broken. Pa had brought them safely all the way home. Ma shook her head and said he shouldn't have spent so much, but her whole face was smiling. And Pa laughed with joy. They were all so pleased. All winter long, they could look out of the windows as much as they liked, and the sunshine could come in. So can you imagine if you didn't have any glass in your windows? Well, in the summer, I guess maybe bugs and mosquitoes could come in and out, but you could still have the windows open. But in the winter, you'd have to close the shutters, and now, they'll be able to look out the windows in the winter. That's pretty exciting. So, Pa said he thought that Ma and Mary and Laura would like glass windows better than any other present, and he was right. They did. But the windows were not all he had brought them. There was a little paper sack full of pure white sugar. Ma opened it, and Mary and Laura looked at the sparkling whiteness of that beautiful sugar, and they each had a taste of it from a spoon. Then Ma tied it carefully up. They would have to wait to have the white sugar until company came. Best of all, Pa was safely home again. Laura and Mary went back to sleep, very comfortable all over. Everything was all right when Pa was there, and now he had nails and cornmeal and fat pork and salt and everything. He would not have to go to town again for a long time. So, look, Laura is looking out of the window, and now the window has 4 panes of glass. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pa brought 8 because they have 2 windows. 4 in one, 4 in another, 8 panes of glass. Pretty exciting. Chapter 18. Ooh, the tall Indian. Oh my goodness. So there's the house, and the wagon, the stable, and it looks like some Indians are coming. In those 3 days, the norther, that we call a northeaster, had howled, screeched across the prairie till it blew itself out. Now the sun was warm and the wind was mild, but there was a feeling of autumn in the air. Indians came riding on the path that passed so close to the house. They went by as though it were not there. They were thin and brown and bare. They rode their little ponies without saddles or a bridle. They sat straight on the ponies, and they did not look to the left or to the right, but their black eyes glittered. Laura and Mary backed against the house and looked up at them, and they saw red-brown skin bright against the blue sky and scalp locks wound with colored string and feathers quivering. The Indians' faces were like the red-brown wood that Pa had carved to make a bracket for Ma. I thought that trail was an old one they didn't use anymore, Pa said. I wouldn't have built the house so close if I'd known that it was a high road. Oh, Jack hated Indians, and Ma said she didn't blame him. She said, I declare, they're getting so thick around here, I can't look up without seeing one. As she spoke, she looked up, and there stood an Indian. He stood in the doorway, looking at them, and they had not heard a sound. Goodness, Ma gasped. Silently, Jack jumped at the Indian. Pa caught him by the collar in time. The Indian hadn't moved. He stood as still as if Jack hadn't been there at all. How? He said to Pa. Pa held on to Jack and replied, How? He dragged Jack to the bedpost and tied him there. While he was doing it, the Indian came in and squatted down by the fire. Then Pa squatted down by the Indian, and they sat there, friendly, but not saying a word, while Ma finished cooking dinner. Laura and Mary were close together and quiet on their bed in the corner. They couldn't take their eyes from that Indian. He was so still that the beautiful eagle feathers in his scalp lock didn't stir. Only his bare chest and his leanness under his ribs moved a little in his breathing. He wore fringed leather leggings, and his moccasins were covered with beads. Ma gave Pa and the Indian their dinners on 2 tin plates, and they ate silently. Then Pa gave the Indian some tobacco for his pipe. They filled their pipes, and they lighted the tobacco with coals from the fire, and they silently smoked until the pipes were empty. All this time, nobody had said anything, but now the Indian said something to Pa. Pa shook his head and said, No speak. A while longer, they all sat silent. Then the Indian rose up and went away without a sound. My gracious, Ma said. Laura and Mary ran to the window. They saw the Indian's straight back riding away on a pony. He held a gun across his knees, its end stuck out on either side of him. Pa said that Indian was no commoner. He guessed that he was an Osage. Unless I miss my guess, Pa said, that was French he spoke. I wish I'd picked up some of that lingo. Let Indians keep to themselves, Ma said. We'll do the same. I don't like Indians underfoot. Pa told her not to worry. Ma does worry too much. That Indian was perfectly friendly, he said, and their camps down among the bluffs are peaceable. If we treat them well and watch Jack, we won't have any trouble. The very next morning, when Pa opened the door to go to the stable, Laura saw Jack standing on the Indian trail. He stood stiff, his back bristled, and all his teeth showed. Before him in the path, the tall Indian sat on his pony. Indian and pony were still as still. Jack was telling them plainly that he would spring if they moved. Only the eagle feathers that stood up were waving and spinning in the wind. When the Indian saw Pa, he lifted his gun and he pointed it straight at Jack. Laura ran to the door, but Pa was quicker. He stepped between Jack and the Indian, and he reached down and grabbed Jack by the collar. He dragged Jack out of the Indian's way. Good thing. And the Indian rode along on the trail. Pa stood with his feet wide apart, his hands in his pockets, and he watched the Indian riding farther and farther away across the prairie. Oh, Pa said, well, it's his path, an Indian trail, long before we came. He drove an iron ring into the log of the house, and he chained Jack to that. After that, Jack was always chained. He was chained to the house in the daytime, and at night he was chained to the stable door, because there might be horse thieves in the country now. They had stolen Mr. Edward's horses. Oh, Jack grew crosser and crosser because he was chained, but it could not be helped. He would not admit that the trail was the Indian's trail. He thought it belonged to Pa, but it didn't. And Laura knew that something terrible could happen to Jack if he was to hurt an Indian. Winter was coming now. The grasses were a dull color under the sky. The winds wailed as if they were looking for something that they could not find. Wild animals were wearing their thick winter fur, and Pa set his traps in the creek bottoms. Every day he visited them, and every day he went hunting. Now that the nights were freezing cold, he shot deer for meat. He shot wolves and foxes for their fur, and his traps caught beaver and muskrat and mink. He stretched the skins on the outside of the house and carefully tacked them there to dry. In the evenings, he worked the dried skins between his hands to make them soft. And he added them to the bundle in the corner. Because, of course, in the spring, Pa will take his furs into town and trade them at the store for all of the things the family will need. Every day, the bundle of furs grew bigger. Laura loved to stroke the thick fur of red foxes. She liked the brown, soft fur of beavers. And, best of all, she loved the silky mink. And she also liked the shaggy wolf's fur. So, we are going to read more about that the next day. Thanks, Aqua Roomers.